There's a website that I don't remember how I ran across it first, but the fellow's name is, let me make sure I get it right, Kevin L. Moore. And I keep forgetting to ask Connor. I'm sure Connor knows him because I think he's, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he's a teacher at Freed, right? Okay, he is. I don't know how I ran across it. He has like a blog, but very, very scholarly fellow. But he also, he writes in a very scholarly way. You could tell he's educated and knows his stuff. But at the same time, it reminds me a lot of Brother Wayne Jackson. It's one of the things that I've always said about Brother Jackson that just impresses me is his ability to talk about something in a scholarly way and yet put it down where, as Brother Cates would say, down where the calves can reach it too. So I ran across this blog, and one day I just kind of was reading several articles, and just, like I said, he's got a good blog. And I ran across one that was dealing with Jesus' inner circle, and I printed that out and held on to it, and I don't know, it's probably been a year, maybe 2 or 3 years. Time kind of gets away, but I've held on to that, and I ran across it again recently. I have just this file sometimes of sermon ideas, and I ran across that recently, and I said, oh yeah, I forgot about that. I want to preach that soon because it's a really interesting blog, article, whatever you want to call it, and so I want to tell you that just for 2 reasons, because it's a good resource. He's got a good blog, and it's a long URL, but you can search Kevin L. Moore blog, and you'll find it pretty easily. But also just to give credit, because a lot of this that we're looking at tonight is from that article. Some of this, sometimes you personalize things as a preacher will do, but a lot of it does come from his article, more than half of it, because it's just a very, very interesting article, very educational, insightful article that he put together. But when we talk about Jesus' inner circle, you may recognize that term as being a reference to Peter, James, and John. We sometimes use that term. They were Jesus' inner circle. But when you see a list of the apostles, such as Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, Acts chapter 1, when the apostles are listed together by name, you always have Peter and Andrew and James and John listed first. Sometimes people try to make way more of that than there is. Oh, that must mean they're more important. Well, that doesn't mean that. But we do notice that. They were the first to be called by Jesus to be his immediate group of disciples or followers. See that in Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20. And then for the interesting thing, though, is when you find the list of the apostles together by name, it's always Peter and Andrew, James and John listed first. But as you go throughout the gospel accounts, after that kind of initial coming to Jesus, of course, John records in John 1 how Andrew goes and he first finds his brother Simon or Peter, and he brings him to Jesus. But after that, with the exception of Mark 13, 3 and 4, Andrew kind of just fades into obscurity, or at least into the background. In Mark 13, 3 and 4, there's really not a whole lot going on with Andrew there. It's got Peter, Andrew, James, and John coming to Jesus and saying, Jesus had made the statement, all these, you see these, they had kind of said to Jesus, do you see this wonderful, magnificent temple? And Jesus says, yeah, do you see this? Not one stone's going to be left on top of another. And then they come and they say, well, tell us, when's this going to be? Mark's account records that it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John that asked him that question. And so that's the reason I say, other than Mark 13, 3 and 4, pretty much fades into the background. Peter, James, and John become what we call the inner circle. There were several times when they were the only ones with Jesus, when the other 9 apostles were not. For instance, Mark 1, 29 through 31, Jesus goes and he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Now, I will tell you, some folks, and Brother Moore is actually one that takes this position in that article, that Andrew was present there because it says it was Simon and Andrew's house. I don't know that I'd say I disagree with him on that. I don't really know where from the text he's getting that other than it says Simon and Andrew's house. But it records that he took Peter, James, and John. So it seems to me those are the only 3 that he took. But again, some folks think Andrew might very well have been there for that one. But we do know in Mark 5:37, when Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus from the dead, he only took Peter, James, and John in there with him for that. When he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, Mark chapter 9, also recorded in Luke and in Matthew, when he went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, he only took Peter, James, and John. When he is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he originally has all 12 apostles with him. Of course, 11. Judas has gone out to betray him. But then he goes a little bit deeper into the garden, comes to this kind of more secluded place, I suppose, deeper into the garden, and he's going to go and pray. And at that point, he leaves 8 of them, and he takes Peter, James, and John, and he goes a little further, deeper into the garden, and he prays. It was just those 3 that went at that point. That's from Mark 14, 32 through 35. And so the questions that we want to kind of begin with, and as we look at this study, why were these men singled out? Why were they set apart? We use that term inner circle, and maybe, when we use that, we think of like, these are his bestest friends, his BFFs, as somebody might say. Maybe. That's kind of what we want to try to unpack a little bit. Why were these men singled out? Why were they set apart? Why were they given unique opportunities that were not available to anyone else? Even in some cases to other apostles. They were given opportunities that even some of the other apostles did not receive. Is it because they were better? Did Jesus like them more? So what might be the reasons for that? That's what we want to answer in our lesson. And then third, what was so special about them? And all these kind of go together. They're really all essentially asking the same question. But we might also word it like this: what was so special about them as to be so privileged as to be the ones that we now refer to as the inner circle? So that's kind of what we're looking to answer in this lesson. 4 different sort of categories. I've sort of renamed these. I didn't necessarily go with the titles that he used, but he kind of breaks his article down, Brother Moore does, into 4 sections to answer these questions, which again really are basically one question. First of all, I want to notice something here. These 3 men, they were kind of odd choices. And what do we mean by that? Well, I'm glad you asked. They were not the most likely representatives of Jesus, right? If you're thinking in terms of how people might think, you might say, okay, Jesus is going to come to earth, the Son of God, deity, is going to take on a fleshly tabernacle, a fleshly body, and he's going to dwell among men 3.5 years or so of really solid teaching, going to mentor these men that are going to carry on that work. Who might we choose? We might have immediately chosen someone like perhaps a Pharisee, a scribe, a lawyer. Again, as we've pointed out before, as they used the term, it was an expert in not necessarily civil law, but in the law of Moses, which of course was their civil and religious law, at least to whatever extent the Romans would allow it at that time. We might have chosen somebody like that. I mean, these are the experts. We might have chosen some leader of the synagogue, maybe the high priest. I mean, he's obviously he does a lot of speaking. The leaders of the synagogue, they get up and they read from the scriptures, and they no doubt did sermons and things like that from the scriptures. So they're going to be more polished as far as what you would think of when you think of an evangelist, when you think of a leader in the cause of Christ. But that's not who Jesus chose for apostles, let alone for what we call the inner circle. These men, first of all, we could notice that kind of the obvious, they were fishermen. Okay, so you're coming down to earth and you've got a 3-year or so period to train these men and get them ready to carry out that work, and they're going to go and teach others, commit these things to faithful men, as Paul's going to point out later in 2 Timothy 2, verse 2. Things thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. So to perpetuate this, you've chosen 3 fishermen? Might seem like an odd choice, right? I mean, their skill, their expertise is in fishing. It's not in teaching or preaching. They're not orators. They're not polished, trained speakers. They have not been to leadership training and things like that. They're just fishermen. They were not men of polish or men of prestige. They were not men of influence. And yet, of course, you know the verse in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7 is God has sent the prophet Samuel to anoint the next king of Israel, and he's seeing these different sons of Jesse. Oh, surely this is the one. He's good looking. He's tall. He's handsome. And God, of course, tells Samuel, don't look on his countenance. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I've refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. These were not men that we might say, oh yeah, those are going to be great leaders in the church. We might even be scratching our head going like, what? We don't do that as much, perhaps because we kind of have, we can kind of skip and see the end of this thing. We see what they become. But at that time, don't you know, people might have been thinking, what? They were not formally educated. That's not to say they were dummies. We're not saying that. And I think sometimes people, when they read Acts 4:13, they misunderstand that. These people, they see the boldness of Peter and John. These Jews do. And it says they perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men. And what that means is they hadn't been to their schools. They hadn't been formally educated in that sense. It doesn't mean that they just, they had no sense at all. Sometimes I've heard people almost present like Peter and John were just, probably illiterate, dumb old fishermen. No, that's not the case at all. They were intelligent. They just hadn't been to extensive formal training. But it is interesting to me when you read the rest of Acts 4:13, it says they marveled and took knowledge of them that they had, been with Jesus. And sometimes when a person has been with Jesus, even today, we're not walking around physically with the Son of God, but when you spend time in the book, in his book, especially you read the New Testament and you're not reading that with just impure motives or reading it strictly out of a sense of duty, but you spend time with the Savior, and I guarantee you it won't be long before people will perceive. They'll take knowledge you've been with Jesus. But these men were not formally educated. These three, we would say, they were not the brightest or most refined of choices, as humans would look at it, of course. We could also point out, though, that they actually had some significant character flaws, did they not? You think about Peter. Here's a man who is unpredictable. He's impulsive. He was quite often swift to speak, slow to listen. That's the very opposite of James 1:19, right? Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. And Peter sometimes was quite the opposite of that. He was often, many times at least, swift to speak, slow to hear, and swift to wrath even. He regularly misread situations. It seemed like Jesus almost always got to keep an eye on Peter because you just never knew what he was going to say or do. It's almost like he needs constant guidance or correction from Jesus. Matthew 14, give him credit now. He is the only one who said, Lord, if it's you, bid me come and walk out onto the water. And Jesus says, come, and he gets out of the boat. Those other guys didn't get out of the boat. Give him that. But here you are, you're walking on water with the Lord, and what does he do? He gets distracted by the wind and the waves. It's like, you just kind of, again, it's easy for us to say this, seeing the big picture and looking backwards on it. But you kind of like, man, you're out there walking on the water with the Lord. I really don't think you got to be worried too much about waves and wind at that point. He's obviously in control of this situation. But Peter got concerned, worried, and he begins to sink. And of course, Jesus gives him a mild rebuke. Wherefore did you doubt? Oh, ye of little faith. Fast forward to Matthew chapter 16. Just after, Jesus wants to know whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am. And some of them say, Jeremiah, one of the prophets, Elijah. Whom say ye that I am? Here comes Peter. He's impulsive, right? You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And of course, he goes on and tells them, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed it unto you, but my Father which is in heaven. I say also unto thee, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. He goes on and he begins to tell them how he's going to go into Jerusalem. He's going to suffer many things. He's going to be killed. And Peter, we studied this not terribly long ago in our Matthew class, he kind of takes him aside and begins what? The text says to rebuke him. You talk about misreading the situation. He begins to rebuke him. You're not going to do this. This is not going to happen. And Jesus gets a little stronger, a lot stronger, sterner with Peter on this occasion. And he says, get thee behind me, Satan. He's not trying to, just say, well, you're the devil. But he's saying, if you would keep me from doing that, if you would seek in any way to hinder me from that or swerve me from that path, that's what the devil would seek to do, because that's why I came to this earth. So you got that situation. You go to Matthew 26, 33 through 35. There they are in the upper room. Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper. All of you are going to forsake me tonight. And, Peter says, what? Well, not me. I'm not going to forsake you. Everybody else might forsake you, Lord, but not me. I'm willing to die for you. Famous last words, right? He meant it. I don't have any doubt that he meant it. But he faltered. John 13, just a little bit later, Jesus is going around. He's going to wash the disciples' feet. Nobody got up, volunteered for that task, right? It seems there's some evidence archaeologically and from other sources that it might very well have been that Peter was sitting in the seat of where the one would sit that typically would have been washing their feet. And so maybe he's a little bit flustered, maybe a little bit embarrassed, humiliated. And he says, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus says, Peter, if I don't wash feet, I have no part with you. Of course, what does impulsive Peter say at that point? Oh yeah, not just my feet, my whole body. And then again, fast forward a little bit to John 18. There they are in the garden. They come to arrest Jesus. Jesus obviously is not putting up any kind of resistance to this. In fact, he's already told them at least a couple of times. He's told his apostles what was coming. And you know what happens, right? Peter says, he whips out the sword. And of course, he wasn't aiming for an ear, I'm confident. But he cuts off an ear of one of the servants of the high priest. Jesus heals him, heals that servant, and says, put your sword into your place, Peter. He says, how shall the scriptures be fulfilled if we resist this? But you see there's just a few examples how impulsive and, just swift to speak, slow to hear Peter could be at times. But, in fairness, James and John had their challenges as well. They seem to have had a fiery temperament, each of them. Mark 3:17, that was their nickname, right? Boanerges, the Aramaic term meaning sons of thunder. Why would they have been given that nickname? Most scholars think it was probably something to do with the incident from Luke 9:54. Jesus has his face set toward Jerusalem. He's coming through Samaria. The Samaritans don't want him to stay there. There's a lot of animosity between Samaritans and Jews. Not all Samaritans, not all Jews, but probably the majority. Samaritans didn't like Jews and vice versa. They don't want Jesus staying in their area. You're headed toward Jerusalem, just keep on moving, buddy. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, Luke 9:54 says, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did or as Elijah did? Do you ever read that and go like, really? I mean, that's kind of extreme, isn't it? If I'm coming through somebody's town or area or whatever, and they say, look, you're maybe it's an ethnic thing, maybe it's whatever, but they say, I don't want you staying here. Just keep moving, buddy. I'm just going to be like, wow, okay then, whatever. These guys are like, Jesus, you say the word, man. We'll be like Elijah. We'll call down fire. We'll burn them to the ground. I'm like, whoa, easy, man. And that's kind of what Jesus says. Like, you don't know what spirit you're of. I didn't come to destroy people. I came here to save people's lives, to save souls. But that's kind of their temperament. And at times they were proud. At times they were self-serving. We just noticed, what was it, a couple of Wednesdays ago, Matthew 20 through 28. They come to Jesus and they say, we got a favor we want to ask. Oh, do you, Jesus says. Well, let's hear it. But from Matthew's account, we learned something else, a little something extra about this. They put their mama up to it. They got their mama to go and ask. Don't you know the other disciples are like, really? Are you serious? You're not only you're trying to pull an end around and get yourself the right hand and the left hand seat in the kingdom. Not only that, but you're going to get your mama to go and do it. Makes it a little harder to say no, I guess, a woman's touch. They put their mama up to it. And so they want a spot on Jesus' right hand and on his left. Of course, Jesus says, are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Of course, it's a reference to the cup of suffering. Are you going to be able to be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? A reference to the baptism of suffering. They don't realize that. They say, oh, yeah, we can drink that cup. We can be baptized with that baptism. He says, well, you will. But to sit on my right hand, on my left, that's not my place to give. That's for my Father, which is in heaven. They had this idea of an earthly kingdom. Of course, Jesus is going to sit on a spiritual throne. But they're thinking in terms of an earthly kingdom, man, and they're kind of, they still don't get it. Because the other disciples, the other apostles, they're angry. They're kind of like they don't realize what Jesus just said. Then he's going to go on, about 26 through 28 or so, and he's going to say, the Lord of the Gentiles, they exercise authority on them, and those that are great exercise authority over them, but it shall not be so among you. Whosoever will be great among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, to be served, but to minister, to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. That's a rebuke really for all of them, but especially for James and John. You come here, they came there with pride and self-serving intentions. So all that just to say, these are not always the people we might look at and go, wow, great poster boys for the Messiah. And yet they're the inner circle, right? Jesus looked beyond all this. He saw their potential. And again, we have the advantage of hindsight. They went on to become great evangelists. I mean, just great, great things they did for the Lord, for the early church. Leaders, tremendous leaders in the early church. They were not sinless, but they were tremendous leaders in the first century church. And I submit to you, nowhere do we see more so the life-changing power of the gospel than in these three men. I mean, the gospel can take somebody who is as stable as water, and that's irony, as unstable as water. Somebody with a fiery temperament that struggled with self-serving ambitions and transform them into selfless, rock-solid leaders, disciples, gospel preachers in the Lord's church. And I'm telling you, God can still do great things through fallible men and women. You may look at yourself and you say, man, I got all kind of struggles. Well, guess what? So did Peter. So did James. So did John. And God used them. Listen to what 1 Corinthians 1, 26 through 29 says. Paul says this by inspiration of the Spirit, of course. For you see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. Remember what we said? These were kind of odd choices in human eyes, by human wisdom. Verse 27, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. These were odd choices for what we might call the inner circle of Jesus the Christ. At least by human wisdom, they were odd choices. See, Jesus saw through all that. He saw their potential. And I assure you, whatever your struggles are today, he sees through it. He sees your potential. And there's so much that we can do. Here's another interesting thing about Peter, James, and John. I don't know that I'd ever thought about this till I read this article by Brother Kevin Moore. These are the only 3 apostles that were nicknamed by Jesus Christ. At least it's recorded. Only 3. You know their nicknames, no doubt. Simon Peter, really Simon. But according to Mark 3:16, he was Simon, he surnamed Peter. That's what the verse says, just simply Simon, and Simon, he surnamed Peter. John 1:42, Andrew has at that point brought Peter, Simon, to Jesus. When Jesus beheld him, he said, "Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas," or Cephas, we sometimes pronounce it in English, which is by interpretation a stone. So here you have Simon, who is nicknamed or called Petros, which is Greek for an Aramaic word, Cephas, or we say it in English, Cephas, and it means a stone. Now, when you think of a stone, we sometimes say, boy, nothing's going to break that because it's solid as a rock. Say, well, man, I hit that and it really hurt. That thing's hard as a rock. In fact, there was a whole series of insurance commercials several years ago. What was it, Prudential, I think? Oh, you can rest easy because why? You're on the rock. They even had this logo with a big, huge, massive rock formation. Was that Peter? Not during the lifetime of Jesus here on this earth. Not for some time will that be a description of Peter as far as firmness, stability. And so it seems Jesus has given him this nickname for what Peter was expected to become. And perhaps even there could be a conversation that's not recorded, we don't know. But maybe Jesus said, Peter, one day, and I know you struggle right now with these things, but there's coming a time when your Lord needs you to be rock solid. And you remember that. And you work toward that goal. You work on being more thoughtful, not just impulsive. Proactive instead of reactive. I need you to be firm and stable for you're going to do great things, Peter. And so I'm going to remind you of that every time when I call you Peter. Cephas, the stone, rock solid. May very well be that's why he called him that. What about James and John? We already mentioned Mark 3:17. They were nicknamed Boanerges, which is an Aramaic term. It means sons of thunder. This, again, seems to be indicative of the volatile disposition that they both seem to have at the time it was given. And that's what they were currently. Peter was not currently firm, stable, rock solid. And it's like Jesus is saying, this is what I need you to become, Peter. Work toward that. But people are different personality-wise and what motivates them and so on. And so it seems with James and John, he says, this is what you are, but you're better than that. It's not meant to be a jab at them. It's just meant to remind them, you're going to have to work on this. You have a thundery, fiery, I don't know if thundery is a word, but it is tonight. You have this fiery personality, and you're going to have to be aware of that and watch out. And so when I call you sons of thunder, I'm not just trying to make fun of you. I'm not trying to just rub salt in the wound, but I'm reminding you, be on guard. Know yourself. That famous expression from, The Merchant of Venice, I think, Shakespearean play. Know thyself. Actually, that's Socrates. Yeah, that's not Shakespeare. I'm thinking of to thine own self be true. That's from The Merchant of Venice. Socrates, thank you, Bob. But that old expression from Socrates, know thyself. Sometimes we got to know ourselves, and it's like Jesus is saying, know yourself, James, John. You have that fiery disposition. Be aware of it. But isn't that interesting? He calls Peter by a nickname of what he's expected to become. He calls James and John by the nickname of what they were at the time, far different from what he expects them to become. But what's the point? It seems to be two different approaches here by Jesus. Peter's name, again, a constant reminder of the rock-solid man of God that he is needed to become And he needs to be working on constantly to develop that within his own individual character. James and John, maybe they need a constant reminder of a spiritual stumbling block that they've got to work on overcoming. May very well be the case. In 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians rather, chapter 5, there's an interesting passage here. 2 Corinthians 5, and Paul kind of, it seems a similar approach here. Different approaches for motivation to do what we need to do, to become what we need to become. Different people are motivated in different ways, and some of that goes into personalities. We studied personalities a little bit, fairly in depth a while back. Look what he says, though, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 9. Wherefore we labor that whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. Now he goes on, he says, verse 10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Some people, that's what gets their attention. I'm going to be called on the carpet one day, so to speak. I'm going to stand before God and give an account. Some certain personalities or individuals, that really kind of is an attention getter. And everyone's going to receive the things done in his body, continuing in verse 10, according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. It's all going to be brought out, and I'm going to have to give an account. That for some people, that's really, okay, that gets my attention. Knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, verse 11 says, we persuade men. The terror of the Lord, the terror of being lost forever in the devil's hell, that gets some people. He goes on and he says, verse 14, for the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. Well, for some folks, it's the love of Christ. It's the promise of reward in heaven, and loving him because he first loved us. But you see the different motivation for different types of people, different personalities. I want to notice one other thing, and this I think is very interesting. I don't know that I had ever considered this until I read this article by Brother Kevin Moore. The strongest, and that's in the form of a question. The strongest? We often refer to Peter, James, and John as the inner circle. Maybe automatically we think of them as the strongest because of this. I know I typically have. But think about this. We've already noticed the individual struggles that they had. And think about the eternal significance of the work that Jesus is going to have them doing, especially when he ascends back into heaven. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus made them the inner circle because they needed the extra one-on-one time with the Lord to grow and to develop into what he needs them to be. You know, I knew a young fellow several years ago in school that he needed sometimes some extra one-on-one time with the teacher. And sometimes the teacher would even say, Chad, go move your desk right up here beside mine. Well, you know, I didn't sit there and go like, look at me, inner circle. I knew that wasn't exactly the situation. But I also know that, in hindsight, a lot of times it helped me. It helped me stay out of trouble. It helped me to develop. And sometimes I actually, developed a close relationship with several of my teachers because we spent a lot of time together. Maybe they needed some extra time with Jesus to grow, to develop, because they've got some things that they need to work on. And you know what? Even today, every member of the body of Christ is unique. We each one have unique talents, unique potential, and we all have unique struggles. I think about another passage. I'm still in 2 Corinthians, but I'm going to go back just a little bit to 1 Corinthians in chapter 12. And he begins there at verse 13, and he says, by one Spirit are we all baptized into one body, whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, have been all made to drink into one Spirit. The body is one, he says. And of course he says that the foot shall say, because I'm not the hand, I'm not of the body. Is it therefore not of the body? It's a rhetorical question. Of course it's still of the body. Individual function, individual unique potential. If the whole body were the eye, verse 17, where were the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where were the smelling? But now hath God set the members, every one of them, in the body as it hath pleased him. How are there many members, yet but one body, verse 20? The eye can't say to the hand, I have no need of thee, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. And notice what he says. He talks about different parts of the body, those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, there in verse 23. Upon these we bestow more abundant honor, and our uncomely parts have more abundant comeliness. Our comely parts have no need, but God hath tempered the body together, having given more abundant honor to that part which lacked, that there should be no schism, division, in other words, in the body, but that the members should have the same care one for another. It's interesting, he even says in verse 26, whether one member suffer, all the members suffer with it, or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. Each member of the body of Christ is unique. You see, we might be tempted to think, inner circle, they spent the most time with Jesus. Man, they must have really been something else as far as like spiritual superheroes. I don't know if I can say it for sure, but I think this makes a lot more sense. It may be that Jesus says, I need to spend some more time with y'all because I've got to help y'all develop into your potential and reach your potential. Maybe you have struggles. Don't let that discourage you. Just say, I'm going to spend more time with the Lord. I'm going to spend more time in the Word, and I'm going to reach my potential because I assure you, He sees it in you. Nobody else might see it, but He sees that in you. He wants us to reach our potential. He wants us to tap into our own individual talents that we can use for Him within the confines of scriptural authority, but He wants us to do that. He wants each of us to overcome our struggles. They may or may not have been the strongest among those 12 apostles. But Jesus saw the potential. The Lord looks on the heart. And then finally, let's consider this question of, we asked the question, the strongest. Now let's ask the question, the longest. Because here's another interesting thing about them that, again, I don't know if I considered it before I read this article. Peter, James, and John, they had very different lengths of service in the kingdom of the Lord. After some 14-ish years of preaching the gospel, James is martyred by Herod Agrippa I. Acts chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Herod takes James, he imprisons him, and he has him beheaded. He imprisons Peter and intends to kill him, but an angel comes and miraculously releases him. 14 years of preaching the gospel, now James has gone to his eternal reward. Peter, some 30 years, and tradition tells us that he was martyred by Nero, the emperor, somewhere probably in the mid-60s. This would be, of course, AD 60s. 2 Peter 1:14, he mentions that. He says, knowing that shortly I must put off this, my tabernacle, even as our Lord Jesus Christ has showed me. And it seems to be a reference back to John 21:18 and 19, where Jesus says to Peter, when you were young, you girded yourself, you clothed yourself, and you walked wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch forth your hands, and another shall gird you and carry you where you don't necessarily want to go. Paraphrasing that. And it says in verse 19, this spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, follow me. Well, Peter served about 30 years. So you've got James, some 14 or so years. Peter, about 30 years. John, though, somewhere around 70 years. He reportedly died. Again, we don't have his death recorded in Scripture. It's from tradition and historical reports, but somewhere around the end of the first century, near 100 years of age, as we're told. Reportedly, the only apostle to have died a natural death. In other words, the only apostle, reportedly, not to have been martyred for the cause of Christ. But 70 years. And this goes back, I'm not going to re-preach the sermon from two or three Sunday mornings ago, but it goes back to show us the point from that, Jesus' parable of the laborers in the vineyard, Matthew 21-16. It is not the time or the length of service in the kingdom of Christ that is so important. It is the heart of service. James, for his 14 years, served Jesus Christ diligently, faithfully, it's required in stewards that a man be found faithful, 1 Corinthians 4:2, and he was faithful. And for some 30 or so years, Peter served his Lord faithfully. And James, for some 70 years, served his Lord faithfully. There's no seniority in the kingdom of Christ, just faithful or unfaithful servants, stewards of the master. All three of these men served Jesus faithfully for whatever time that they had. Now, what about me? What about you? Can you relate to Peter, James, and John? Are you maybe an unlikely representative for Jesus? We might sometimes view ourselves and say, well, I don't know that I'm exactly a poster boy for the Lord, but maybe he sees the potential. Maybe you even might think because of your past. Maybe you might think because maybe I don't think I have all the talent of somebody else or all the ability of somebody else. I might think of myself an unlikely representative for the Lord, but just remember the Lord doesn't look as man looks. Are you sometimes weak and in need of some extra support? That's why Paul says, bear you one another's burden and so fulfill the law of Christ. Sometimes we need that, don't we? That's a heavy burden that I need help with. You know, later on, just a couple of verses later, he's going to say, every man shall bear his own burden. That's the idea of like a backpack, a knapsack, something that's light. You carry that. But this burden here in Galatians 6:2 is a heavy burden that you're going to need help with. It's like trying to carry a huge stone. Are you sometimes weak and in need of some extra encouragement, extra support? Are you determined to serve the Lord faithfully, whether that's a long term of service or a short term of service? And here's the thing. If I'm willing to serve him, if I'm willing to obey him, follow him as a disciple, then I am, in essence, a part of Jesus' inner circle even to this day. I love what 2 Chronicles 14:1 says. The Ethiopians attacked King Asa. And Asa cried unto the Lord his God and said, Lord, it is nothing with thee to help, whether with many or with them that have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on thee, and in thy name we go against this multitude. O Lord, thou art our God. Let not man prevail against thee. What a prayer. What a statement. You may feel weak, you may feel like you're nothing, but you're something when you're standing with Jesus Christ, when you're standing with God the Father. Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. 1 John 3, verse 1. Hebrews 2, 9 through 11. I love what the Hebrews writer says there. He says, we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. And he goes on in verse 10, he says, for it became him by whom are all things. And he says it became him for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one. Listen to it. For which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren. Jesus says, you're a child of God, you're a Christian, you are my brother. Are you a child of God tonight? You may think, again, you may say, I'm not a very likely representative. Boy, I've made some serious mistakes. I've got some serious weaknesses. That's okay. Jesus can see through that potential. And if you're willing to come to him on his terms, and you're willing to spend time with him in his word, the life-changing power of the gospel, just look at Peter, James, and John, you see it. And he can take the most useless individual, seemingly useless, and he can do great things with them. But I got to come to him. And so as the song says, oh, why not tonight? What is hindering you from coming to the Lord and saying, I'm ready to make a change. I want to stop living for myself. I want to live for the Savior, and I want him to, as another song we sing says, have his way with me. And I want to realize my potential to do good things for the Lord. He's not ashamed to call them brethren that come to him and that are in Christ. Are you in Christ Jesus tonight? Maybe you've done that and you're not where you need to be. Maybe you need that some extra help, some extra encouragement. Again, Galatians 6:2, bear you one another's burden. Can we help you with that in some way? What a great lesson from these three men. They weren't superheroes spiritually. They were regular old men. And I don't mean to downplay what they did for the Lord or what they did for the cause. But what I'm saying is you and I, we can do great things. The Lord can do great things through us. Got to be in Christ, abiding faithfully in Him. And we got to be growing. Can we help you with that in some way? If so, that's why we extend the invitation. Why not tonight as we stand to sing to encourage you?